we are going to work our way through a bit more of Ephesians. So if you have a Bible in front of you, open your Bible up to Ephesians chapter 6. If you do not have a Bible in front of you and would like one, raise your hand and I will find a minion to help me with getting Bibles handed out. Does anyone want to have a Bible in hand that does not have one? Looks like we're pretty much okay. Those who want one have one, and those who don't need it. All right, so I'm going to read, kind of work through these things. Yes, Deaconess. Okay. Oh, thank you. Thank you so much. Next Sunday, the 17th, Elizabeth Froh, our Pastor Froh's daughter, has been a member here for, I don't know, 3 or 4 years, maybe something like that. She is being commissioned and installed as the deaconess at Grace Lutheran Church in Grass Valley. Now, this is really a big deal and a wonderful thing. She's been studying and working toward this for many years, and I would really like, as much as possible, for us to have a nice group of people here from Holy Cross to wend their way up to Grace.
Do they have to be nice people?
Pardon me?
Do they have to be nice people?
No, they can, even you can go. So yeah, the service is at 3 o'clock on Sunday, the 17th, 3 o'clock in the afternoon. I will try to get a poster or something up for that for next Sunday, but if you can kind of put that in your head as a possibility for making your way up there, I'm sure it'll be a beautiful, beautiful service. Grace, if you've not been there, has a wonderful sanctuary, a great organ and musicians. It should be a delightful service. I know we had a nice group of people went up when Pastor Schaff was installed there a few years ago as the pastor at Grace, so I'm sure it will be a great time along the way. So that's next Sunday. Thank you. Yeah. All right, Ephesians chapter 6 and following. I'll do these kind of a paragraph at a time. And remember, in chapter 5, we kind of worked our way through chapter 5, where this whole section began with submit to one another out of love for Christ. And so we had husbands and wives was kind of the first portion that St. Paul deals with. And now we're moving on to some other particular vocations, places that he wants to highlight. And I don't know, honestly, if these were particularly a problem in Ephesus or if these are sort of universals. Probably more the latter. Children, obey your parents in the Lord, for this is right. Honor your father and mother. This is the first commandment with a promise, that it may go well with you and that you may live long in the land. Fathers, do not provoke your children to anger, but bring them up in the discipline and instruction of the Lord. All right, so here we have the first one, and it kind of starts off with that word obey. And what is it that I want you to try and kind of get into your head when you read that word? You remember? Listen. Listen is the first part of that. To obey, first of all, means to hear. That is an integral part of obeying. Not that this would ever happen with my children, of course. But I can remember quite vividly when I was a child being told to do things sometimes, and sometimes I would actually start to go and do it before I understood what it was I was supposed to do. Which isn't actually obeying, is it? Because I wasn't listening. So that's an integral part of this. Is first of all, it means to hear, listen, and then do. So, and he simply quotes the fourth commandment here: honor your father and your mother. And as I learned it, and at least some of you learned as you were a child, along with the promise. Honor thy father and thy mother, that it may be well with thee, and thou mayest live long on the earth. That's the way that I learned it, at least from the 1942 Catechism. So we get this starting off that this is a problem. It should not surprise us that as human beings we have problems listening, right? And in the same way, because we have problems listening, we have problems doing at the same time, because those two are integral to each other. They go together. So the first thing that we do as parents is teach our children to listen. And how do we do that? How do we teach our children to listen? Bill?
I think part of it is setting a good example.
Okay. So we teach them to listen. Do you mean by listening? Is that what you mean?
Right, by listening.
Okay. Yeah. So and that is sometimes hard too. So we do it by example. What else?
Positive and negative reinforcement.
Sure. Yeah. Positive and negative reinforcement to encourage when they are listening, and to discourage when they're not. Correct. When they're not. That those two things kind of go together. That this is a learned skill. It's not something that comes naturally. We by nature, because of sin, do not listen naturally. I want to listen to my own voice, my own thing, not listen to somebody else. And that, and you can see that in a 2-year-old, and a 12-year-old, 20-year-old, doesn't matter. A 90-year-old, doesn't matter how, that is not an age-dependent thing. Listening is always a learned and relearned skill. But that listening also includes doing. To actually listen and then to follow through with what that is. So St. Paul kind of holds this up and says, look, this is your vocation, this is your calling as a Christian, is to listen and do to the parent, to your parents, to the ones who are over. But he doesn't end there, does he? He then points out specifically to fathers. Fathers, do not provoke your children to anger, but bring them up in the discipline and instruction of the Lord. So, what does it mean for a father to provoke their child to anger? What does that, I'm not going to say what does that look like, because I think you know what it looks like. But what does it mean? What does it mean for a father to provoke his children to anger?
Overbearing.
To be overbearing, to take that obedience as to take that in a way that becomes domineering. So to make it so that it is only about obedience, and it is not actually about, if obedience means listening and doing, that means that it is the vocation of fathers. I think I would say fathers and mothers, ultimately, but here he does really kind of pull out fathers. It is the vocation of fathers. If the children are to listen, the fathers are to speak in a way that can be heard. Does that make sense? Have you ever had your father speak in a way that you couldn't hear what he was saying? Of course you have. Because that is also the failing of every father whom I've ever met, myself included, is that there is always a temptation as fathers to allow our own either emotion, our own perspective, even our own rightness, to interfere with our ability to teach and to speak. Ben?
Seems like you can also provoke them by being too hands-off.
Absolutely. Oh, no question. Yeah, provoking to anger does not only mean to be overbearing. It might mean to be underbearing? I'm not sure if that's a word. But yeah, to be so hands-off and distant and removed that this actually brings and angers a child. You know, a lot of times, if you're talking about children's behavior, you're sort of looking at why is it that this child is always wanting to misbehave. Well, one of the common reasons is that the child wants to have what? Attention. They want to be paid attention to. And when a child gets to the point where the only way that they can actually get their parents' attention is by singing, that is obvious. That doesn't make their behavior right, but we as parents also have to look at what got the child to that point so that they're doing that. Does that make sense? Dennis, you had your hand up. No? Okay. Yep. Any other hands or thoughts? Why do you think, of all of the things to bring up, why does Paul bring this up here and now in the context of mutual submission? You know, we've just had this section on marriage. We're going to have a section on servants here in just a minute. Why this? Yeah, Ben.
It's reminding us that with obedience comes responsibility.
Yeah, absolutely. That my vocation as a husband involves sacrifice. My vocation as a father involves what? To bring them up in the discipline and instruction of the Lord. That is my vocation as a father. I have an explicit responsibility to teach my children what it means to be a disciple of Christ. I mean, don't overread this word discipline. You can see the word disciple in there. To be disciplined is to follow in a certain path, right? So that's what disciple is. A disciple is a follower. So when I bring a child up in the discipline of the Lord, that means I'm teaching them to follow Christ. How? First of all, Bill's example, by following Christ myself. But then by giving them the Word. That's how this works.
I think it's maybe not only subtle, but a subtle point to start. Go back to verse 1, that's not even up there anymore. Is that obey your parents in the Lord.
In the Lord. Yeah. Isn't that
This is
interesting?
not doing anything, don't exercise authority.
Sure. And this is actually a sub-theme that Paul gets at here a couple times in a couple ways in this chapter. That the reason that we obey, the reason that I teach and give instruction, the reason that a servant is to do what their master instructs them to do, is because this is a vocation. That is, this is a calling that God has put you in. And so, why should a child obey their parents? Because God has put those parents over them. Now, this is, couldn't pull it up real quick, but that's one of my very favorite Lutheran quotes from the Large Catechism. It's this section on the fourth commandment, where he basically says, children should learn to obey their parents, no matter how peculiar and strange they may be. and I've always liked that. That this obedience, this listening and doing, is not based on the righteousness of the parent, right? Because parents, as we all know, are not always that righteous. But it is based on the fact that God has put them over the child. So that's a very different way of looking at it. And that is going to kind of flow through all of these different vocations along the way. Thank you, Rick. I appreciate that. Other thoughts on Suzanne?
I've always kind of thought too that when they're so little children and they're first learning to obey,
Yeah.
it's kind of like their first understanding of obedience, which they're going to need to learn to obey their parents if they're going to ever learn to obey God.
Right. If their own learning to listen and do is foundational to being able to live with other human beings. Right? If you can't listen and then in turn do, that means you're not going to know how to live under laws. You're not going to know how to work in a work environment, because every work environment I've ever seen or experienced involves laws, right? And those mean you have to be able to listen to them. So as parents, what we do is teach them how to live with other people. And at the very beginning, that involves speaking and listening. You know, how often does, you know, the quote unquote terrible twos is mostly about listening, I would argue. But that's what's going on there, is teaching a child to listen. And to not just, if you will, listen to the voice in their own head. Which is tempting for all of us, I would say. Okay, anything else on this? Can I go on? Don.
When I think of temptation, we have uncontrolled offers. Releasing what we have pent up.
Sure.
Has disappointed us. And, we have to just be very careful about allowing ourselves to get into that position. Because the Lord does close you off.
Yes. Yes.
Yes.
Right. To discipline does not mean to respond in anger either. I mean, and that's always it's always a challenge for parents when it comes to discipline, is to some degree to be able to remove yourself emotionally from what's going on, and to figure out what is the response that's actually going to be helpful here, not simply what does my heart tell me, because my heart may tell me that's what my heart might tell me. That's probably not going to be a helpful response, right? So yeah, that's definitely the case here, and there's lots of room for repentance and faith with parents and children, no doubt. Anything else on this one? All right, this one is almost more difficult. I don't know. Bondservants, where there is doulos. So doulos is the word that can mean anything from servant, kind of hired hand, to slave. All right, and that's the range of this word. Bondservants, obey your earthly masters with fear and trembling, with a sincere heart as you would Christ. Not by the way of eye service as people pleasers, but as bondservants of Christ, doing the will of God from the heart, rendering service with a good will as to the Lord and not to man, knowing that whatever good anyone does, this he will receive back from the Lord, whether he is a bondservant or is free. I'm going to stop before I talk about the master section. So, I mean, we get this a little bit more in the book of Philemon, but here, remember that you have in the ancient world a vocation, a station, or a place of bondservant, of a doulos, that does not have a nice, simple, clean parallel to what we think of today as slavery. It just doesn't. A bondservant in the first century had a place in the society, had a place in the household, had certain rights as a bondservant. This was a, contract isn't quite the right word, but there is definitely a sense of mutual obligation there, not simply property. So this is a perfect example where we get a word, and I think that's why they use bondservants in the translation there, and not slaves, because that's how you very easily could translate that slave. It is often translated slave.
And it is in the study Bible.
And it is in the study Bible? Yeah. So that's why, that's a perfect example of a word that kind of is a hand grenade for us, and that isn't necessarily all of the kind of our modern baggage and history and background. That doesn't all fit necessarily there. It does kind of, but it doesn't necessarily. So he says, obey, that's the same word we had above. Listen and do, obey your earthly masters. And that is literally the word, obey your lords according to the flesh. That's how you would literally translate that. Okay, so this means your Kyrios, Kyrie eleison, that's the word there, Kyrios, your Lord, according to the flesh. Obey your earthly masters with fear and trembling, with a sincere heart. Why a sincere heart? That's kind of an interesting phrase. And not by way of eye service. So, sincere heart means to actually do it, and not just do it when they're watching. That's what eye service means. Eye service literally means to only do your job when somebody else is watching you.
It also means to do it
from the heart.
really with the
Yep.
commitment that this
Yep, and that's there. He kind of gets at that a little bit more later. Doing the will of God from the heart in verse 6. So eye service means to only do something when someone else is watching. To only do it when you have to. And he's saying not like that, but to listen and do as if you were doing it for Christ himself. Sincerely, truthfully, that's what that means. Not by way of eye service, as people pleasers. That's an interesting word there, isn't it? Yeah, as one who tries to make people happy. That's what that means literally. I'm going to guess that many of you have either had employees or have been employees that would you can kind of see in this picture, right? The person that only seems like they're doing what they're supposed to be doing when somebody else is watching. Yeah, Marion.
So this brings a question to my mind that I haven't thought of before. Did whole households convert to Christianity when they took their service?
Yeah, definitely.
Was there any choice on the part of the
No.
servants?
No, or the family, or or anyone else. You can get that in Acts a number of times. And so was baptized and their whole household. Yeah, very much.
Decides this is the way to go, then everybody goes.
Well, honestly, that is the case through most of history, frankly. Our understanding of even of individuality is still relatively modern. And I'm not really making a critique on good or bad on that one or the other, but that is very much the case. So, you can imagine in Ephesians, in Ephesus, however, if the top dog in the house, if the head of the household is converted, then everyone's converted. That doesn't mean that the ones in the household may not be converted on their own. And we certainly get cases, numerous cases in the scriptures of the slaves, of wives and children and others coming to faith that is not a part of the household. And it doesn't take a lot to imagine a scenario where a bondservant, a slave, is in a household where the head of the household is pagan, is not a Christian. And now they're kind of in this question of, well, so am I supposed to obey this person? And notice too, near the end there we get, rendering service with a goodwill as to the Lord and not to men, knowing that whatever good anyone does, this he will receive back from the Lord, whether he is a bondservant or is free. So notice that word, whatever good is done, he does. Paul is not saying, do what they say, even if they're commanding you to sin. You understand my point there? He's not. Now, there is a whole huge realm where you've got things that are explicitly sinful that you may be commanded to do, that as a matter of conscience you say no and you accept the consequences. And then there is this humongous bucket of things that may or may not be sinful, that you may or may not like, that may or may not have good or bad consequences, but that are not sinful. They may be dumb, but they're not sinful. That's what Paul's talking about here. It's that whole kind of realm. And again, I mean, we can very easily and quite naturally apply this. We're not just talking about first century slavery. We're talking about your vocations today, your job at work, whatever it is. Bill.
Did most people who, I'll say most bond servants of that time, did they enter into contract voluntarily or not? Or
Sometimes. That's good. That's a good question. There are a couple of ways that people might become a bondservant. It might be through war. Okay, so someone would be captured in war, and that would be considered part of the spoils of war. But you might enter into a bondservant arrangement because of debt, for example. If you want to get out of debt, you can enter into a bond service for a certain length of time, for example. Yeah, it's a good question. So it may or may not have been entirely voluntary. Sometimes, definitely. Is there another hand up that I missed? Okay. All right. So again, noticing there in verse 8 that whatever good anyone does, he will receive back from the Lord, whether he is a bondservant or free. So this benefit will be of benefit to you, regardless of your legal status. Essentially, that's what that's getting at. So now let's look at the next one, masters, and that's the word lords. Lords, do the same to them, and stop your threatening, knowing that he who is both their master and yours is in heaven, and that there is no partiality with him. So, masters, do the same to them. What is the same there? What's that referring to? Masters, do the same to them.
Be sincere.
Be sincere. Act sincerely and not as a people pleaser, and to do good, because this is the right thing to do, regardless of their status. So just like with husbands and wives, and with children and parents, there is a mutual submission. There is a mutual obligation to each other. In the same way, masters and slaves, employers and employees have a mutual relationship, right? So the employer has a responsibility to take care of his employees. I mean, that's pretty simple. And so to not take care of his employees is to defraud them, is to steal from them. So we had in our Leviticus reading this morning, you'll hear it in second service if you weren't there. One of the things in Leviticus was that a master is not to keep his servant's wages overnight. And why? Well, you're not to withhold the wages of your people as a way of controlling them, as a way of threatening them. That's explicitly the point. Does that make sense? So throughout this whole section, what Paul's doing is trying to unpack how our identity in Christ sort of takes on flesh and blood in the world. That this means that I have a relationship to my neighbor in the world, that I may have a vocation, a place, a station, and that vocation means I do what I'm given to do in that place because that's where God has put me. I mean, this is kind of Lutheran doctrine of vocation here, very, very simply. And that's never an excuse to sin, but this is a way that God uses us to take care of the world. Very good. Yeah.
Keep me on track. Is this simply the proper application of one gospel in our station in life?
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. That's what's going on here. Is that if God has put me in a certain station or place in life, you know, let's say, just for the sake of argument, that I am an employee at a place and I really hate my job. I think that my boss is an idiot, and and that I could do his job way better than he can.
You guys work in the same office?
I'm just, speaking hypothetically. And so now I have a bit of a dilemma, don't I? My dilemma is, so do I do what the dingbat boss says, even though it's a dumb thing to do? What's the answer?
Yes.
Yes. And if it's that bad, find another job. But I do not have the freedom to simply say, well, because I'm a Christian, I can ignore the law. I can't. That's not actually being a Christian. Now, there may be mechanisms within your job that, there's all sorts of ways and places and things that you can deal with these things, but to use the system that God has put in front of you. And sometimes, this may come as a great shock to all of you, sometimes in our vocations, we end up suffering. Right? That is what it is. And your suffering may actually be how you are to bear Christ in that place. All right. Let's go on, because this is kind of the fun part. I mean, it's all fun, but let's go on a little bit. Finally, verse 10, be strong in the Lord and in the strength of his might. Put on the whole armor of God, that you may be able to stand against the schemes of the devil. For we do not wrestle against flesh and blood, but against the rulers, against the authorities, against the cosmic powers over this present darkness, against the spiritual forces of evil in the heavenly places. All right, I'm going to take that bit first. So this is Paul's kind of last encouragement to the church of Ephesus on their identity, on who they are as the baptized. Be strong in the Lord and in the strength of his might. And then we get the setup, put on the whole armor of God, so you guys kind of know what's coming here, right? Put on the whole armor of God. Why? So that you're able to stand against the schemes of the devil. I was very surprised when I looked this up that the word schemes is the word methodia. Methods. That's where that word comes from. Yeah, so against the devices of the devil. That's kind of what's behind that there. And that this whole armor is what will allow you to stand against the schemes of the devil. This concept of standing is an important one in kind of Greek culture and thought, but also in biblical culture and thought. And this is the notion of think of Jesus' description of John the Baptist. Remember that he is not a reed blowing in the wind, going going whichever way the wind is going. This is this concept in Greek thought of holding your place, of not allowing your passions to rule you, not allowing your own kind of whimsical desires to sort of take control. And so that's good Greek language, but that's also very good biblical language too. I mean, Jesus himself uses this image. It says, as a Christian, I am to be steadfast, immovable, always abounding in the work of the Lord, knowing that your labor is not in vain. That's the picture, right? And so a part of what we as Christians do is we learn in our identity that I can be in this place and can be Christ in this place to these people no matter what comes at me, that I'm going to be there. And that is also, by the way, very much military language, right? I mean, he is quite literally talking about the whole armor of God here in just a second. And so he's talking, do you remember, I know that I've made this description of the phalanx numerous times here, this Roman arrangement where you would have one, the centurion would be in the front with a shield, and then the next guy would have his shield interlocked, and so on and so on and so on. This is called a phalanx, so it allowed them to have this kind of position where as long as everyone stood their ground, it was basically unbeatable because everybody is standing in place. There's no gap, there's no chink in the armor, and they move as one. Now, if anybody doesn't stand, the whole thing collapses, and the guy that's going to be left holding the bag is the centurion that's in the front. So that's the picture you get here of the church as one that stands on the confession of Christ and is immovable and not afraid, especially in the face of the methodia, the schemes of the devil. Is everybody with me? All right. And then we get, for we do not wrestle against flesh and blood. So we're not talking about an earthly battle here. And then we get this interesting line against rulers, authorities, cosmic powers. That's a strange one. Cosmic powers over this present darkness, these spiritual forces of evil in the heavenly places. So we get these four things here. Rulers, authorities, cosmic powers, spiritual forces of evil. These are most likely not just synonyms of the same thing, but are probably ranks of demons. Just like there are ranks of angels, archangels, seraphim, cherubim, we get all of these different ranks of the angels. This is most likely language about the ranks of satanic forces. So you get authorities, rulers, and those words in and of themselves are kind of generic words. That word authority is the word that's used all over the New Testament for authority. Ruler, same thing. Cosmic powers is kind of a weird one, if I recall. Yeah, Cosmorkrator, monarch of the world.
The force.
Yeah, the force, thank you. That's what that means. So the one of the ancient names for Jesus is the Pantokrator, the ruler of the entire world. So this is the Cosmokrator, the ruler of the cosmos, and that's a title given to Satan. So think about how Satan is given a certain amount of rule in this world, a certain amount of power and authority in this world. That's the language we're getting here. Okay? So the cosmic powers over this present darkness, which also implies not the eternal, but only for time. And then we get spiritual forces of evil. That's kind of a strange. This is pneumatikos porneia. That's the Greek word for evil is porneia, pornography, evil writing. So this is the spiritual power of porneia, of evil. And then this I think is the weirdest part of this whole thing. In the heavenly places. Now, when I typically use the word heaven or heavenly here as kind of an adjective, I think of heaven's where God is, and hell is where Satan is, right? That's kind of common. Here, the word heavenly doesn't mean heavenly versus heaven versus hell. It means the physical world versus the spiritual world. What I can see as compared to what I can't see. Okay? So that's what's meant by the heavenly places here. Is that these are the forces of evil that exist all around in the spirit. Okay? So we don't wrestle, this going back to the beginning here, we don't wrestle against flesh and blood. And because we aren't wrestling against flesh and blood, the weapons of war of this world cannot suffice. That won't do it. Because those are the wrong weapons, because that's the different enemy. Okay? Because we are talking about forces and rulers, authorities, powers, etc., that are not going to be defeated by the tools of this world. Does that make sense? Everybody kind of tracking along here? We are just about out of time. It's okay, we'll finish Ephesians next week. Yeah. Therefore, Paul's favorite word, right? Therefore, take up the whole armor of God, that you may be able to withstand in the evil day, and having done all, to stand firm. So you get those two pictures there. To withstand, that really means to resist. That's the picture there. And then to stand firm. That's that same language we had at the beginning. So take on the whole armor of God, so that you will be able to resist the evil and stand up in the fight, and not cower in fear and give up. That's kind of the implication. I do think that there's a lot that we could talk about at the idea of withstanding in the evil day. This is an interesting idea, and something that I firmly believe is going to be a great challenge for us in the years and decades to come, is what does it mean to resist evil? Resisting evil doesn't necessarily mean sort of trying to recreate the moral majority from the 1980s and making sure we get right legislation passed or whatever. I suppose that could be part of it. But to resist the evil means to show mercy when nobody else does. Because nothing undoes evil greater than mercy. Because mercy is the opposite of evil. That's gospel, not law. So I kind of want you to get that little picture in your head here. Is Paul is not trying to create this picture of the Christian as the great new lawgiver that is going to go out and beat everybody into doing what they're supposed to do. That's not the picture that Paul's trying to give. But that the gospel is the weapon that undoes the evil one. Forgiveness, mercy, compassion. Not the law. So I'm going to end with that thought in your head, Lord willing. We're kind of unpack this a little bit more and wrap this up next week. Anybody have any last minute questions or thoughts, etc.? It's really good to be back with you guys. I miss you all very much. We close with benediction. The grace of our Lord Jesus Christ,